Well, we will go ahead and get started. I am Brooks Berndt. I'm the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. Excited to be coming to you with this month's installment of the Creation Justice webinar with my co-host, Michael Malcom. Michael, for those of you who don't know him, he wears more hats than I can count. It's like a walk-in closet full of hats. He's the senior pastor of Rush Memorial Congregational UCC in Atlanta. He is the executive director for Alabama Interfaith Power and Light, the executive director for the People's Justice Council, and I'm just getting started on that's the short list of his hats. So great to have you on here, Michael. The plan for today is that Michael is going to give us some theological framing for our conversation today, and then we will hear from a very special guest, Nick Estes, as he presents to us about Standing Rock and the long tradition of Indigenous resistance. At the end, we'll have time for questions and comments. And as you'll note, there's also a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. At any point, you're welcome to put a question there, and we will seek to address those questions later on, either by typing responses or responding to them verbally. So with that said, Michael, I turn things over to you to give us some theological framing for our conversation today.
Yeah, thank you, Brooks. Thank you all for being with us. In light of our guest today and true affection for his position as well as kinship with his position, I'd like to talk to you all about allowing for leadership to take place from the grassroots up. Barack Obama said, "The best education I received was working with people in the community on a grassroots basis." Because what it taught me was that ordinary people, when they are working together, can do extraordinary things. I believe that Jesus may have said it something like this: the last will be first and the first will be last. There's an unknown tribe that has a quote that I found that I'd like to share with you all. It says, "Treat the earth well. It was not given to you by your parents. It was loaned to you by your children. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children." That is the best perspective that I've seen on inheritance when it comes down to how we should leave or view the earth. This particular inheritance, or the way that we should view the earth, should be done in regards to a bottom-up approach. And the way that we should look at keeping the earth should be from a bottom-up approach. And our Indigenous brothers and sisters, our First Nation, are keepers of the earth, have been keepers of the earth from past until now. And I think it's time that we start taking a listen from those that we have actually put last, because the last should be first and the first should be last. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from Brother Nick Estes.
All right, thank you, Michael, for that framing for today. And now I am delighted to present to all of you, Nick Estes. I first learned about Nick back in March when he was interviewed by Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! Then got the audio book version of Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance. I'm the kind of person that likes to hear a sermon rather than read a sermon. So I've been listening to it. They take the train into work. And so it's been terrific, and it's continuing to impact me in multiple ways. And I'm delighted now to present Nick to all of you so that all of you can be impacted as well by his incredible work and perspective that he's bringing to us. And so, Nick, I thank you for what you've done. I think it goes without saying, anybody who has read a little bit of your bio, that you are more than a scholar of the struggle for liberation, but you are someone who is deeply engaged in the struggle for liberation. And so it is a tremendous honor to have you here with us today, and we will let you take things over.
Hamatake api nape chuzapi chante washte. Let's just say a greeting in the Lakota language, which actually translates, hello, my relatives. I greet each and one of you with an open hand, or with a handshake and an open heart. And I just want to thank both Brooks and Michael for inviting me onto this webinar. And to be honest, as the book tour has progressed, I have spent more time in churches than I have in the last 2 decades of my life. I'm not somebody who goes to church regularly. I was raised in an Episcopalian home, but I practice, our traditions and try to keep them as much alive as possible. And my grandfather, who I'll be speaking about shortly, was actually a minister within the church, and it was through the church, the Episcopal Church, that our languages stayed alive. Our Lakota language stayed alive, but also it was how we could mobilize politically, because we couldn't organize openly for the longest time. And so very much like the civil rights movement, a lot of the movements against determination legislation that we successfully defeated in the 50s and the 60s began with the church and the clergy. And I just wanted to give that little shout out because it's not a well-known history. So I'm going to do a screen share and share some slides with you, just to kind of give some background about myself, but also the book. So just bear with me. Let's see if this works. Okay. Can you all see the slides? Okay.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, so I will just start. This is the cover of the book, obviously. It's a picture. I want to just talk a little bit about this because I think it frames the book itself. This is a picture of the Crow Creek Riders. They're a group of young, high school age, primarily young men who were invited by the chairman of the Crow Creek Sioux tribe to actually be a part of the Standing Rock movement itself. And as I was kind of negotiating about a book cover, a lot of the covers that were proposed had images of like the more spectacular kind of forms of police violence. And I really didn't feel like that captured the movement that I saw, because it was young. It was a young movement, and it was one that was very positive. And I think the level of police violence that was inflicted on water protectors tends to overshadow what the movement itself is about. And the next picture I'm showing here is, and I guess my really good friend Michelle Latimer took that photo that made it onto the cover of the book. The next picture that I'm showing here is just kind of a map to kind of put you into the context of the Oceti-Sakowin territory, the Oceti-Sakowin Makoche, as we call it. Oceti-Sakowin means the nation of the 7 council fires. Oceti means fire, Sakowin means 7. And unfortunately, this map is a little bit limited because out in Minnesota, that's actually our eastern boundary. But this is more so showing the political and legal territory through which these pipelines trespass. So in the northern part, you can see where my cursor is, you can see the Dakota Access Pipeline cuts through not only the 1851 treaty territory, but unceded territory of the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. And there's another map, but I don't have it here, but it actually shows how the pipeline was originally meant to go north of or upriver from Bismarck, which is a white-dominated town, but then was rerouted through the northern tip of the Standing Rock Reservation. So technically the pipeline itself doesn't cross reservation lands, but it does cross treaty territory. And so that's why it's contested. And the number 6s that you can see here on this map are actually our current territorial boundaries. So we went from this, which is about 70 million acres of territory, about the size of the state of Nevada, down to this diminished territory. And I don't really know the acreage, but it's very small. And you can also see on this map, which is on the inset at the beginning of the book, the strategic placement of these 5 earthen-rolled dams, beginning with the southernmost dam, Gavin's Point, Fort Randall, Big Bend, Oahe Dam, and then Garrison Dam. They are all downriver of Indian reservations. And so these dams were built as part of the 1944 Flood Control Act. But I just wanted to give you all a visual of what it looks like. And so to kind of put this into a contemporary context, the current Keystone XL pipeline cuts through the heart of the western half of South Dakota, which is actually considered our permanent reservation homelands for the Great Sioux Nation. So the current Keystone XL pipeline is going to affect and is drawing into conflict the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, the Lower Brule Sioux tribe, where I'm from, the Rosebud Reservation, the Rosebud Sioux tribe, and as well as the Pine Ridge Reservation and Yankton, because it goes down this south, but also the Fort Peck Reservation, and then further south you have Ponca and Winnebago as well. So this picture, I think, really captures the historical context of Standing Rock itself. This was taken by Lindsay Norton on the day, on October 27th, 2016. It was the day of the more violent police raid against one of the treaty camps. And I detail the kind of context of that raid in the book, but I think this picture itself speaks volumes. I wasn't there the day of the raid, but I was there afterwards. And this is Rochelle Bullhead. She's an elder from Standing Rock. But what's interesting about this is we see, it's a very striking image. You have the police behind her, and she's dressed in her traditional regalia. But what's not really known is that on her dress, she's wearing copper pennies, and they have red ribbon threaded through the ears of Lincoln. And so they drill a hole in Lincoln's ears and they thread the red ribbon through. And I'd always seen this, but I had never known what it meant. And it was several days after the raid when it was decided to ceremonially burn the remnants of the raided treaty camp, which included like teepee, canvases, tents, ceremonial items that were confiscated, because the private security and the police had returned the camp's remnants to us with all these ceremonial items, and they were soaked in urine. Somebody had urinated on all the items after they were returned, and it wasn't just like a small heap. This is like the items for several hundred people. And so there was a large trash heap that was put into Oceti-Shawkoni camp, the largest of several camps. And they had, it smelled of urine. And this elder gathered several of us near our camp and kind of told the story about the penny dressed and how in 1862, during the Civil War and during the U.S. Dakota War, the uprising the Dakota waged against the United States for imposing starvation conditions on our people, the result of that was the sentencing of around 300 Dakota men specifically to death. And Lincoln ended up communicating the sentences of most of them except for 38. And they were hanged in Mankato, Minnesota, and forced marched from Fort Snelling in the day after Christmas. And so they're hanged on December 26, 1862, the same week that the Abraham Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And months later after that, the Lincoln had ordered a punitive campaign, an expedition against our people, which resulted in the massacre of about 400 people who had nothing to do with the uprising that took place in Minnesota. But that happened in 1863, and Rochelle Bullhead was actually a descendant of the survivors of that genocidal war. And she talked about how the reason why they wear the penny dress, and it's to remind Abraham Lincoln, who didn't listen to us when he was alive, but maybe he'll hear us in the afterlife, that we are human beings. And in this context, it was President Obama, Kyle Kirchmeier, the sheriff of Morton County, the sheriff of Morton County, and the governor of the state, I'm blanking on Jack Dalrymple, who didn't listen. And so this was a reminder, it was like a reminder that this history is very much alive and present with us to this day. And as she was dancing, it was really surreal. This is a picture of the floodlights that were kind of blaring down on us after she finished telling this really tragic story. And a lot of us, a lot of us began to cry, but it wasn't, she reminded us, these aren't tears of mourning, they were tears of liberation. And when people cry in our culture, they say that the ancestors are speaking through us. And she reminded us that like we've survived genocide after genocide, and we will survive this genocide. And I think this picture encapsulates kind of the experience of that, because even at night there was this intense level of surveillance and militarization. And the only time I've ever experienced that outside the context of Standing Rock was when I visited Palestine. And one thing that I noticed about a lot of the people who would come to our homelands is they would comment on the sort of natural beauty of our homelands. And, it is a very beautiful place, but somebody who has grown up there, who was born and raised along the river and who grew up with the river, and knowing the stories of the river, to me, it is a beautiful place, but it's also a place of immense amount of tragedy that preceded the Dakota Access Pipeline. And this is a picture of the Missouri River. This is actually a picture of my grandma my grandma Cornelia Shawala's allotment, which is currently underwater. And so this is actually not a natural, the natural state of our river. It's actually an altered state. This is a result of the damming. The river was never a mile across as it is in this picture. But I think the story that I really want to foreground in my work is not a story of just of tragedy, but a story of resistance, and a story of deep ancestral knowledge combined with kind of the prophecy of a better life. And this is a picture of a place that was once called Harney's Peak, or Harney Peak, which we call Hiankaga Paha, or which has been recently renamed Black Elk Peak. And Harney was a lieutenant who we called woman killer because he massacred women in an encampment. And so we used to joke that this was once called Woman Killer's Peak, but it was renamed for Black Elk, who, as many of you may be familiar, had his vision of a coming indigenous future here at this sacred site. And for us it's the closest that we can get to God or Creator, because it's the highest point between the Appalachian Mountains and the Rocky Mountains, and it's centrally located within the Black Hills and then within the heart of our territory. And to this day, we don't have unrestricted access to it. It's mediated by state park agencies. We were just there last week, and they harass us every time we go up. But nonetheless, we make our annual pilgrimage to this sacred site. And Black Elk himself, has been mischaracterized as somebody who believed in the kind of death of our nation, and he's been misquoted and misattributed to saying certain things, such as our nation's hoop is broken, or that we were just kind of essentially fading into the past. But he never said those things, and nor did he ever believe those things. And actually what he believed in the actual recordings, or the actual transcriptions of the interviews that he had with poet John Neidhart, who wrote Black Elk Speak, actually suggests that he didn't view like the Wounded Knee Massacre as the end of the resistance or the end of the ghost dance. But in fact, he says something along the lines that the tree of life has strong roots in the ground, and it will bloom once again, and that it's our job as Lakota people and as Indigenous people to ensure that the tree of life continually blooms over and over again. And I think if since the Bandaloria has called Black Elk Speaks like the kind of like North American Bible of all tribes, I think if that translation had made it into that popular text, that we would have a different understanding of prophecy and what Nicholas Black Elk actually believed. And he believed in the continual renewal of life after Wounded Knee and after genocide and after tragedy. These things weren't just kind of like truncated for us. But he, you know, he continued on. He lived a full life himself, you know, a Catholic in many respects. But this picture right here is a photo from a friend of mine, Yadika Fields, who took a picture of the Veterans March that happened on December 4th, 2016. It was around the time that Obama had rejected the EIS, the Environmental Impact Statement, and required Dakota Access to essentially refile. So it was a delay, and it was a temporary victory. But nonetheless, I think this in itself demonstrates the impact, not just for Indigenous people, but for non-Native people as well. Around 5,000 veterans came to essentially stand with water protectors. And it says something when the institution of, you know, that has committed horrific crimes against our people and committed acts of genocide, not just against the Lakota people, but also against our non-human kin, such as the Buffalo Nations, actually refused to stand against us anymore and actually chose to stand with us. I think that was a very pivotal moment. And to suggest that this, like when we say Indigenous decolonization, or when we say decolonization, it includes everybody. It's not just an Indian problem. And this picture is also interesting too, because it reflects, like, we see these black and white photographs typically of Native people, especially like massacres. And this one is like, you know, kind of it like has that feeling, that same kind of affective feeling, but it's one of life, and it's a movement of life, of what happens when we, you know, when we stand with each other against these injustices. And the next thing I want to turn to is just to kind of ground our kind of epistemology and our belief system within the context of our longer history. And this is actually our oldest winter count pictograph that exists currently, or at least that I know of. And it's actually, it says it takes place in the first year of the 9th century, or the 10th century. And I don't know how accurate that is, but this is from Brown Hat's winter count, and it actually shows the arrival of Teskawi, the white buffalo calf woman, who essentially made us Lakota people, who brought us back into correct relations with the human as well as the non-human world. And you can see to the right of the camp circle, there's a list of all the different animal nations that she brought us back into relationships, such as the buffalo, the elk, the deer, the antelope, beaver, etc. As well as within the camp circle itself, she's depicted as a white buffalo. And from her udders are actually falling corn kernels into water, and then above her there's a corn stalk and an elm tree, or a corn stalk, an elm tree, and a yucca plant. So it demonstrates our kind of like relationship with not just animal life but plant life as well. And she was the first person to bring us to make our first treaty, essentially. And ever since then, every time we've signed a treaty with the United States, it's under this impression, under the auspices of this original covenant that we made with Teskawi. And the reason why I bring that up is because typically there's a distorted view of us as Lakota people, and first and foremost as like being primarily male dominated. If you just Google images of Lakota people, you'll often get kind of tintype black and white photographs of like the men of the 19th century, our great leaders, such as like a Red Cloud and Gall, etc. But because it was a male dominated view, you know, cast onto us and how they viewed our history, we've also internalized that history as well. And this picture is just a picture of the warrior women that I grew up knowing. On the left is Dawn Dakota. It's the daughter of Madonna Thunderhawk and the sister of Marcella Gilbert, who's on the right-hand side. And then centrally located is, or the one in the blue, the light blue shirt is Phyllis Young, who was actually a tribal councilwoman for many years. She was also an American Indian movement activist, and was foundational to this movement prior to, you know, even prior to 2016. And I quote her at length in the book, and you can read the things that she says, but she relates it to this ongoing tradition of being a water protector. And of course, Madonna Thunderhawk and Marcella have a film about them. If you want to go check it out, it's called Warrior Women. It's airing on PBS right now, but I highly recommend it. It gives such a counter narrative to the Red Power movement if you're interested in it. The other thing that I think is incredibly important is somebody like Madonna Thunderhawk founded what we now know, or what were called survival schools, which were essentially alternative education programs for young Native people during the Red Power movement, to essentially pull them out of these very racist and discriminatory settings of public schools that many Native families, found themselves in because they were relocated off the reservation. And that very much continued at Standing Rock. And this is just a picture of the Defenders of the Water School, which was an alternative education program for young water protectors, carrying on that tradition. So this is a generational thing. And I think we think of protests as like the kind of like loud moments of spectacle and, clashing with police violence. And we forget that it's what sustains movements through time is the building of institutions. And I would say like Indigenous institutions themselves, such as survival schools, were foundational to passing on this knowledge from generation to generation. Also, it was like the 10th largest city in North Dakota at the time. So you had to do something with the kids, right? You had to send them to school. The other thing that I think was really important for me personally, that I didn't see a lot of kind of recognition of, was the recognition of Two-Spirit people. People that follow along the LGBTQ spectrum, because they are so marginalized within our communities. And when the patriarchs came, they left patriarchs when they left. And we've internalized a lot of the anti-gay sentiment, the anti-trans, anti-Two-Spirit sentiment within our own communities. And for me, this was like a huge homecoming for a lot of folks and our relatives to get recognized. And they weren't just part of the camps, but they were leading a lot of the direct actions and the prayers, and really upsetting this kind of normative understanding of, binary gender roles, or just kind of like male dominated spaces. And actually one of our comrades, Jaden, she's on the right-hand side. She's part of our organization. She's wearing our t-shirt, the Red Nation. So she was part of it as well. And this is them. This is the Two-Spirit camp at the front lines with the police. They led an action that day. And I thought it was just a really great photo. This is just kind of like a bird's eye, or a view from the top of like a camp. I think it was in August when I was there. And the first thing I did was, I just started creating a shelter, a cook shack, and that cook shack actually survived the Northern Plains winter, as well as, feeding thousands of people. But the people that, I was like working with were, there was this like Palestinian network administrator who lived in Yankton, who like came up. He just heard, he just kind of dropped everything and came up. And we started digging compost holes, and we built this cook shack, and alongside of like, friends of mine, such as like Josh Schwager, who was like a line cook in, Bismarck, North Dakota. And so it was really just people, like everyday folks. And of course, this is a picture of Dennis Banks, who was one of the co-founders of the American Indian movement. He was there as well. These are some of the folks from left to right. It's Cooney Dog, who has run AIM security, or American Indian Movement security, for as long as I've been alive, and probably going back to the 60s or 70s. And to his right, or to our right, next to him is Dave Archambault Sr., who is actually the Dave Archambault II's father, who invited the American Indian Movement to Standing Rock in 1974 to essentially take our treaty claims to the World Court. And it was foundational in actually creating the document that we now know as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which was passed by the UN in 2007. And then to the far right is Bill Means, who is one of, he was Russell Means' brother, but he was also kind of the brains behind a lot of this this work. And so it was just cool to kind of see this generational stuff. These are just some photos of what it was like kind of on a daily basis of being there. Is very militarized. There's a lot of things that happened that I don't think people realize happened. This was a common practice called hooding, where they'd put hoods on water protectors after they arrested them. And so that kind of gives you an idea of like what happened at camp. And there was as much as there was the direct actions happening, there was this kind of like community building that was happening as well. And I want to turn to my own family's history really quick before I continue on. And this is a picture of the Big Bend Dam. It flooded our lands in 1963 when it was built. It actually relocated us for the second time. The first dam, the Fort Randall Dam, relocated us for the first time. And as a result of these two dams, the first one relocated 1/3 of our population, and the second one relocated or displaced a half of our population. And actually the dam was supposed to be built upriver from us, and we didn't know until like months before they started constructing it that they were going to put it downriver from us. And we had already been, faced relocation and started rebuilding our community by the time they started construction to flood it again. And it was originally supposed to go upstream, but it was rerouted, or it was removed further downstream to save the white-dominated state capital of Pierce, South Dakota. Much like the Army Corps of Engineers rerouted the Dakota Access Pipeline to not contaminate the water of Bismarck, North Dakota. And this is a picture of my grandfather's. The tallest one is Andrew Estes. He was, my biological grandfather. He was a Lakota code talker. He fought in World War II. And when he returned home, he came to find his lands, essentially targeted by the same military that he fought for, because the Army Corps of Engineers is a branch of the military, and most people don't know that, even though it's a quote-unquote civilian branch, whatever that means. And so this is the original Lower Brule town site prior to Big Bend. And you can see the trees that exist in the river bottoms. These were lush river bottoms. And as a result of the construction of the dams, it destroyed 75% of our wildlife, which included wild plant life, such as plums, chokecherries, buffalo berries, etc., as well as destroying 90% of our commercial timber. And I don't know how much agricultural lands were lost off the top of my head, but it was quite a bit. And so if you see this picture, this is the picture as the floodwaters were coming through, and that island that existed up here has those trees that are just being flooded. And the Army Corps essentially said, we paid you for those trees, don't go cut them down. And they prevented us from actually cutting down the trees. They basically said they're ours to waste. As a result of the flooding, we were once subsistence economy, and kind of like subsidized our caloric intake with a lot of the so-called free goods of nature. And as a result, they introduced white flour, white sugar, milk into our diets. And you had I think it was like a 95% increase in diabetes. And of that generation, half the people acquired diabetes, which prior to that, diabetes was entirely unknown to our reservation community. So it had that health impact, as well as that kind of psychological impact of facing relocation, having your entire lands, your bottom lands destroyed. And my grandfather, he was a water protector at this time. He fought the construction of these dams, and he's pictured in the center. He's the tallest one. This is the old tribal council buildings, like literally right before they flooded them. And this picture I think is interesting as well, because, there's this image of us as like these native people who ride bareback and just hunt buffalo and just are nomadic, but we were actually farmers, and we had a sense of agriculture. And this proves that, during this reservation period, most of us had community agriculture. But when we were relocated up further up into the hills, the topsoil was really bad, and so we couldn't reproduce our lifestyles that we had in the river bottoms upriver or in the higher elevation, because the soil was bad. And so it wasn't that we didn't try to redo it. It was just that we didn't have the quality land to redo it. And this is just a picture of, you know, the many roads on our reservation that currently lead to nowhere, into the water. And so I told this family history in Chicago during the protests, and that was actually organized in Chicago, co-organized by the Chicago Indian Center, as well as movements such as Black Lives Matter. And, you know, my grandparents couldn't have imagined that this, you know, millions of people would have rallied to defend our river, because at the time that the dams were being constructed, there's no public opposition to the construction of the dams or the sacrifice of our people and our lands. And so in that sense, it's very meaningful, but also it's generational, because they were water protectors before I was, and before many of us were. I want to turn to, just to kind of wrap up, that, like, what this movement represented and like what's happening now. And so this is a picture of a hand-drawn map that was given to people who were attending the camp. And I think it really demonstrates the kind of values that the camps themselves were trying to put forward in the movement itself. And you notice that there's these are kind of named after the different roads of different Native nations, as well as revolutionary heroes within our own tradition. But also in the key below, there's host kitchens, first aid, and security. Host kitchens, where to get free food. First aid, where to get free healthcare. There was also the legal tent, which is up here, free legal aid, you know. So, and then also security, who weren't armed, but they were, you know, charged with kind of like keeping out drugs and alcohol. But given like the opportunity to reconstruct our own, you know, communities based on our own traditions, you know, we prioritize need first, which is healthcare, food, quality food. It wasn't just like, you know, eating out of a can. It was quality, healthy food for us, as well as education with the defenders of the water school, as well as free legal aid. And, you know, most poor communities in the United States don't have access to those things. And there isn't any reference to the militarization that was happening all around us, right? And so outside of this world that we were trying to create and live in, there was this, you know, the armed bodies of the state essentially trying to crush it. This kind of gives you an idea of, there was this post that kind of gave you an idea of all the different places that people had come from. And I just put this on here because Albuquerque's here, 505. The other thing that was really funny is that they would, the police would constantly issue these public or these social media posts to demonize and criminalize the water protectors. And this one says 359 out-of-state agitators arrested in North Dakota. And when we saw this, we were like, yeah, that's really cool. Look at all the solidarity we've got from all over the country. And so, and my argument would be like, this is a representative of the infrastructures of Native resistance, that, you know, at the time, you know, it was like Trump was just elected in November 8th, 2016. And this was the only thing that was like going on that was a resistance camp. And people were so disillusioned by the elections that, you know, the camps just surged with numbers, which is good, you know, and we welcome the solidarity and support. And I contrast that image of infrastructure with this image, which is the pipelines that are proposed to be built, or that are currently built. And this is where the Dakota Access Pipeline is built, and this is where the Keystone XL pipeline is proposed to be built. And what you can see is you have the Alberta oil sands up in the north, and the Bakken oil region down in the south. And the Alberta tar sands is essentially it's like the size of Florida, the landmass, and it's created this dead zone. But you have all of these pipelines emanating from there. So if Dakota Access Pipeline is the black snake, as we call it, then the Alberta tar sands is the snake pit where a lot of these things are coming, and they're drawing into all these different movements. You can see that, you know, Dakota Access Pipeline goes through Illinois, then cuts down into Louisiana, and the latter leg of the pipeline was fought. It was called the Bayou Bridge fight, and that just kind of wrapped up recently as well. but nonetheless, like along the way, it's kind of drawing together these kind of these different communities and bringing us into a different kind of struggle. These are just pictures from one of the communities in Houston, near the oil refineries. It's a primarily Latino community, but I had a chance to visit there as part of the quote unquote toxic tour. And it was actually really disturbing. I mean, it was, you couldn't actually breathe. And a way to cover it up is that the oil industry invested in all these like parks for children, but it's like actually hazardous for children to be out there and playing in them. So there's no children playing in these parks. But this is the future that I think is on offer right now. If we don't do something about climate change, it's not just about Indians, taking up the resistance, but this is everybody's problem. And after Standing Rock, we didn't just stop fighting. This is a picture of another reunification that we had, a treaty council meeting that we had last summer at the base of one of our sacred sites in the Black Hills. And this is a picture of a treaty camp or a resistance camp that has been ongoing prior to the Dakota Access that we formed in our own reservation to resist Keystone XL, and that we will continue to resist. That was formed in like 2013, and it still exists today. And it's brought into conversation kind of different elements of our community to really discuss, not just, we're not really like just about stopping oil pipelines, right? We actually stand for something that's more than just about stopping oil pipelines. We're doing cultural programs, we're doing programs with youth, we're doing things that actually build community and not just are about protest, even though that's it's an existential requirement for us if we're going to have clean drinking water for the future to fight these oil pipelines. And right now, we are battling court cases or legislation in the state of South Dakota that actually criminalizes being a water protector, that actually makes it a felony in the state to protest quote unquote critical infrastructure bills. And that's happening across the board, whether it's in Louisiana, Texas. They implemented anti-protest laws following a lot of the large rebellions led by Black Lives Matter, and they're implementing protest laws following the uprising at Standing Rock. But we are fighting back. I mean, the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation banned the governor of South Dakota from entering our reservation lands because she refused to consult with our tribes prior to the passing of that legislation that she introduced, that was actually drafted by TC Energy, formerly known as TransCanada Energy, the constructors or the builders of the Keystone XL pipeline. So I was actually on a phone call prior to this talk about how do we combat this legislation, not just at a state level, in a tribal level, but how do we combat it at a federal level? Because the oil industry has used and weaponized the quote unquote tools of democracy against us in pushing for these kinds of infrastructure bills. And so I implore everybody who's involved in social justice organizing, or who wants to get involved or can't be involved, but they can offer financial assistance or resources or just educate folks to really look into these things. ALEC is something that we're working on right now. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, unfortunately, but we're rolling out a campaign within the next couple of weeks to combat ALEC, which is promoting all of these anti-protest laws. But also, we're hosting locally a new campaign called the Red Deal, which is an Indigenous environmental policy that's not contrary to the Green New Deal, but we see as kind of building an Indigenous platform from the ground up. And we're having our first rollout session here in Albuquerque on Wednesday, but then it's going to align with protesting and calling for a moratorium on fracking in our own state here in New Mexico on Thursday, which is going to be organized with the youth run up to Santa Fe, which is the Roundhouse. So if you want to support those efforts, we are a volunteer organization. We don't get big grants or foundation money. So it's therednation.org. If you want to check it out, please do. Everything helps. So I just want to thank you all for taking the time to listen. This photograph, this last photograph, is a picture of some high school students that I worked with in 2011. Many of them became leaders in the Standing Rock movement itself. And this isn't a movement about death and like getting beat up by cops. It's actually a movement for life. And I just want folks to remember that these are real people, and that Indigenous people are on the front lines of these things. We're political by default because we're always in the way of development, and that the targeted assassinations of Indigenous environmental activists has been noted by the United Nations, and it's also been noted by the United Nations that these laws to criminalize Indigenous people, or what they call as protesters, is across the board. It's not just happening in the United States. The U.S. is leading a lot of it, but it's not just happening in the United States. It's something we experience globally. So yeah, thank you very much for listening, and I guess we'll turn it over to some questions.
Great, thank you so much, Nick. That was terrific. There was one question that's already popped up in the Q&A box. It pertains to just kind of asking you to elaborate a little bit more on the meaning of water protector. I'll just add also that your book, I thought, for me, did a much better job than anything I had previously read in kind of getting at kind of the cultural, spiritual meanings of the phrase water is life than I had been reading like in the news, have you. So I really appreciate that aspect of the book and encourage people to check that out. But if you'd like to elaborate on the meaning of water protector, that'd be terrific.
Yeah, this kind of came out of the kind of demonization of quote unquote protesters, right? And there are some people who don't like the label of protester because it actually minimizes what they're trying to do, and that they are like caretakers of the land, they're caretakers of the water, and that should be respected. And I personally 100% agree with that position, but I also, I'm also like, yeah, but I'm also a protester, and you can be both. They're not mutually exclusive, because you can stand against injustice, and you should be proud to protest. But that's something, the water protector is something that anyone can be. And I think, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a water protector because she was at Standing Rock. And the way it was told to me is that anybody who crossed that camp gate became a water protector just by default, by being there. You stood with us, whether you're there for a day, whether you were there for like 10 days or several months, whether you donated online, whether you supported in some way, or you got in an argument with your family over dinner about it. It was something that everyone could like own and be proud of, and I think that's important. And the second part of that question is mini wichoni, which is like water is life, and it's not a neat translation. There's an esoteric kind of understanding that water, we say mini pashuta tokahe, which is like water is our first medicine. And it's not just like we're just sitting around and like, being avatars like on Avatar the movie and plugging into the Matrix or whatever. But like that saying actually comes from Tammany, which is another name for the Black Hills, which actually means uterus. Actually means her water is the translation. And so when we say mini wichoni, mini pejuta tokahe, water is our first medicine. It's like we were all born in water, right? And we all require water to live, and that's what it means. It's not like water is the beginning of life for us, in that sense. And so that's where that meaning it goes back. It's actually the second. It's part of our creation story. It's the second, Tunkashila, or the second grandfather, so to speak. And while you can say like, water is life in English, it doesn't have that same kind of connotation. And so when we say mini wichoni, that's what we're saying. But I do think that at the end of the day, that water is a fundamental human right, and that should be the basis alone, that we should say that like Flint deserves to have clean drinking water, period. You don't need to make another like, you don't need to extrapolate on that or make another justification. Native people deserve clean drinking water. Poor white people deserve clean drinking water, right? Everybody deserves clean drinking water. That should be the basis, fundamental human right. And so that's the other aspect where we say water is life as well. It's like, it's a universal.
All right. Thanks for that answer. We've had some other questions pop up. dovetailing with what you just commented on, one person asked if you have any comments on the concept of the rights of nature.
Yeah, I'm like, I know that's going on throughout the world, and it's like good, you know, and I think it creates a critical conversation. But my, I mean, I'm not trying to be like a Debbie Downer or trying to like be critical, but my question is always like, well, humans don't have equal rights under the law. And so what makes us think, you know, like for the longest time, Indigenous people weren't even considered human. You know, Black people weren't considered human. Many people of color and colonized people throughout the world were considered human. And we still don't have equality under the law. So what makes us think that the law is something that can grant personhood to nature? And while I'm sympathetic to it, and I do think it creates a critical conversation, we've passed the rights of nature in the state legislature here in New Mexico, but it has not stopped them from fracking. It has not stopped them from polluting our water. It has not stopped them from mining uranium. And so I think like, while it's like the move is important, there also has to be a critical understanding of like the system itself.
Great, thank you for that. Another question here is if you can say more about work intersecting with Palestine or Palestinians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is a really good question, because, and it's not just with Palestine and Palestinians. One of the things that I found really disturbing and also just very interesting when I was reading some of the released emails from these private security companies, as well as the law enforcement that were operating the pipeline protests themselves, is that they were talking about Ferguson, they were talking about Baltimore, they were talking about the US-Mexico border, as well as Palestine, all in the same breath, while they were policing an Indigenous-led uprising in Standing Rock. And so it doesn't matter if I say it like as somebody who's a historian or somebody who's an activist or whatever. It doesn't matter if I say it, because they're already making those connections. They're seeing these uprisings as related, as part of a global counterinsurgency project that they're a part of. They're looking to Palestine and seeing how Israel polices the Palestinian population, and they're looking at like how, you know, the Ferguson uprising and like how local law enforcement policed Black populations. And the interesting thing, you know, the other fascinating thing about this is that you cannot deploy tear gas or pepper spray against a foreign nation or a nation of people who are considered sovereign, right? But yet Israel continually uses chemical weapons such as tear gas and pepper spray against civilians in Palestine, and so does the United States, because we're not considered sovereign people. And so I think that's a really fascinating thing. It's actually a banned weapon of war that can still be used against civilian populations by their states. Yeah, and I mean, there's more comparisons that one could draw, but I think just looking at the private security operations and the law enforcement and the way that they draw inspiration from policing Black folks, policing Palestinians, is very crystal clear. They understand with like to a T. They have training sessions about this. You know, they're not confused about the connections. So I think it's incumbent upon us as organizers to be really conscious of that and to incorporate it into the work that we do.
All right. So we've got 5 minutes left. I'm going to try to wrap a couple of questions that I've got together, and if you can give an answer to all of them in one sentence. But so one question that I've got is kind of more on a practical level. What can congregations do to connect to Standing Rock today, or to connect to more local Indigenous struggles, you know, being not present near Standing Rock? That's a question. And then another question is more thoughts on how decolonization work can take place across the country to protect water, land, and air. So just giving us some thoughts on what we can do to engage.
I think like the first step is to look at the role the church and the colonization of the Americas, like specifically for example, like in where I'm from, some of the clergy that came out and colonized, or that were part of the colonization process on our reservations, were actually awarded land as part of, personally, they were awarded land, and many of them donated it back to the church, and more so the Catholic Church than kind of Protestant faiths. But nonetheless, I think that's an important aspect, but looking at like the things such as the doctrine of discovery and understanding the ways that this papal bull has been incorporated and codified within U.S. law that essentially says Native people aren't humans. And it's something that we've been working vehemently to get withdrawn. The third thing that you can do is to figure out whose land you're on and try to figure out what kind of relationship do you have with those people, and how are you incorporating it into how you're talking about being, one of the interesting things, and this is kind of tangential, but the word Indio actually comes from, like some people say, a Latin, like means in God. So Indio, Indian, actually came from the colonizer seeing, God in each of our potential converts essentially in us. But like, what is your relationship as a congregation to the original people of this land? And understanding that history, but also your current connection. What are you doing for it? And as far as decolonization, I think that's the most important step as well, is to think about that this isn't just an Indigenous problem, that it's actually your problem as well. And I don't know a single Indigenous organization that is turning away alliances with the church, or with churches, or with progressive churches. That doesn't mean that we're looking for guidance, but there's been a history of alliance with the church, of Indigenous people of faith who have been working with the church, or working, in tandem to seek a common kind of goal of liberation, because it's a question. Decolonization involves Native and non-Native people. It's not just our struggle, and so I encourage folks to think about it. You can follow Caitlin Curtis on Twitter and social media. She's an Indigenous person of faith who does a lot of work with churches and stuff. So I'd recommend following her work. And I can give you, she has a reading list as well to help with folks, but she also has a book called Glory Happening, and another one, I don't know what it's called, but it's coming out. So I would check out her work, and because she thinks through a lot of these things. I'm trying to figure out her. Hold on one second. I have her stuff right here. Okay, so it's Kaitlin, and it's Curtis, Curtice.
Great. And someone just posted in the chat box a link to her.
Okay,
I'll
cool.
just quickly mention, there's probably old news for a number of people joining us, but a lot of denominations, or a fair number of denominations, have materials on the doctrine of discovery.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll try to post a link to some of that as well in the chat box. So now to wrap up, the tradition of our call is to let Michael Malcom lead us into a call to action. So I'm going to turn this over to Michael.
Thank you, Brooks, and thank you, Dr. Nick. And Dr. Nick, I actually want to ask you a question, but let me frame it this way. Dr. King said, moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives in the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds. That being said, Nick, I know that there are those who are on this call who don't necessarily live in proximity to you in your organization, But what can we do to get involved and to help in this fight with your organization in particular?
That's a really good question. I wish we were bigger, but we do have, we call the Native Liberation Conference happening in September 7th and the 8th. But we will also be, and that's in Gallup, New Mexico. You can find it on the website. But we will also be talking about a larger campaign to fight back against these anti-protest legislations. And it's not, they're going to be happening in you know, across the board in these states. And so wherever you are, you can get involved in that. But also, you know, all land is indigenous land in North America. And so you are connected by default. You know, if indigenous people are default, then political by default, then non-indigenous people are political by default. This isn't about individual kind of like choices. It's structural, and so we have to come at it that way as one people, as people who are united, as you know, in the tradition of King and many others. Yeah, I don't know. That's the best I can offer right now. I mean, it's stay involved and stay informed. Don't just, you know, check out. You know, one day, like, continue to read and continue to challenge yourself. You know, because I can't stop being indigenous. It's something I live. You know, I can't take off the skin, and I can't take off, you know, the day to not be indigenous. So. Gotcha.
Well, we do thank you again, and one of the things that we want to ensure, and I did leave your information in the chat box, but we want to ensure that we cover grassroots organizations, in particular as churches, in that we help build capacity, that we volunteer our time and our talent, but also we support in our treasure as well. We find that grassroots organizations are often the ones that struggle the most, but we do a great deal of the work when it comes down to the movement building and the resistance building. So we want to make sure that we support, and that would be my call to action today, to ensure that we support grassroots organizations and allow for them to lead. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Nick, it has been wonderful to have you on here. We have fortunate enough that we've got a recording of it, and so we will put it up on YouTube if that's okay with you.
Sure.
And just continue to get your message out there and to share it with as many people as possible. I'll send out an email in that to everyone who registered. I'll put a link to the YouTube as soon as we're able to get that up, and also we'll include some links to Nick's organization and other links that have been shared here in the chat. So please continue to stay engaged, and until next time, we'll see you all later. All right. Take care.
Thank you all.